Hey folks, welcome back to the Underground Sessions podcast. My guest today is George Yancey, who's a professor of sociology at Baylor University down in Texas. We're going to be talking about his book, One Faith No Longer, which looks at the political divide between progressive Christians and conservative Christians. This was a really interesting discussion. I hope you'll benefit from it, and I certainly think you will walk away with some thoughts and questions in your mind. So check this out, and as always, we're glad that you're here. Subscribe to the YouTube channel. We hope to see you back for future episodes. All right, well, good to be with you today, George. So this is George Yancey. He's going to be doing our Underground podcast today. Maybe to get us started, could you tell us just a little bit about your background for those that might be unfamiliar with who you are? What fields do you work in? What have you done for publishing? Give us a little introduction.
Sure. So I'm a sociology professor. I work at Baylor University, and I studied a lot early in my career on racial issues, and I've kind of circled back to that.
Mm-hmm.
And one of my things is there a Christian approach towards racial issues? So that's something that I've been very interested in. But I've also been interested in some of these religious aspects. I've been really interested in anti-Christian attitudes per se, because it's like almost never studied in sociology. We study anti-everything else attitudes, anti-Semitism and Islamophobia and homophobia and sexism, say racism. And we'll assume there's no anti-Christian attitudes, but there really is, and it's really quite, how should I say, it is impactful in our society, much more than people give it credit for. But that's led me to all sorts of little side studies, like, studied atheism and cultural progressives. And it kind of led me indirectly to studying the difference between progressive and conservative Christians. So those have been sort of my main tracks that I've been, up to this point, been focusing on racial issues. And then this, religious dynamic of that's at least tangentially tied to anti-Christian attitudes, although not always, a direct one-on-one tie. But I think that's sort of led me.
Yeah, well, if you haven't gotten to read or pick up, George wrote a book called Beyond Racial Gridlock that I found pretty meaningful in the racial discussion over the last few years, and he did some really great work there. So that's worthy of a whole.
I have a new book called Beyond Racial Division.
Oh, right, I did see that. Okay. So
I don't mind people picking up both of them because my bank account could use that. But
all right,
just to let you know, there is a newer book. But if you want to pick up the Gridlock book, that's fine.
I still have some room in my professional development line, so I'll have to go pick that up. How are those books different? Did they just updated or?
Yeah, in some senses. I mean, Gridlock came out in 2008, I believe, or 2007, something like that. So I had 15 years to think more about some of these issues,
Mm-hmm.
and also to contextualize it to today. I've had people tell me that, Gridlock seems like it was written yesterday, but it wasn't. And so there are some things that I think that I could contextualize it more and just allow me to think through, allow me to put more of an application plan together, which I didn't really have when I was doing Gridlock. Gridlock, I was just sort of pontificating. So I think those are some of the differences that there are between the two books.
Yeah.
But, I don't, if people just want to pick up Gridlock, that's fine too.
Well, obviously, I think if the Division one is sooner, since about 2014 was the Michael Brown incident, so there's been a lot of racial discussions, particularly, and in different ways than I remember from like the early 2000s or the 90s. So if you were writing in 2007, the new one would obviously encompass the last decade of conversations that have been happening.
Yeah. It came after George Floyd, and so that was
right.
A big impetus towards that.
Yeah, good. Well, we'll have to maybe do another one specifically focusing on those. But today we're getting into 2024 and the election cycle's heating up. So I wanted to discuss your book, One Faith No Longer, which, if I'm correct, is a sociological study on evangelicals and their politics. And I'm interested to see if this anti-Christian sentiment that you're mentioning here, I don't know if that plays in here, but I'd be interested to know more about that as we go along. So it sounds like you've done some significant work in this area, and we mentioned a couple of your other books. So maybe let me just ask you, why did you write this particular book, One Faith No Longer? It came out in 2021, right? So after the 2020 election. What did you see that needed to be addressed in the writing of this book?
Well, what's kind of interesting is I'd done an earlier study when I had academics, and I was interested in their religious attitudes. And so I asked them to rate different religious groups. And what I found surprising, which I had not anticipated, which is always the best find, it's the ones you don't anticipate,
Yeah.
because then you know it's not biased, was that people who saw themselves as mainline Protestants ranked conservative Protestants lower than they ranked almost every other religious group. I'm trying to remember if they ranked more than atheists. I think they did. I think that they were down there with the atheists. Uh, Now that wasn't true with conservative Protestants and mainline Protestants. They ranked mainline Protestants not as high as conservative Protestants, but pretty high. But for mainline Protestants, they ranked them lower, and that was sort of like an aha moment. Like, what's happening here? You have a Christian group that hate. I don't want to say hates, but at least ranks lower. Another Christian group lower than almost all of the non-Christian groups. That got me thinking about
Mm.
the divide between progressive and conservative Christians, and that got me wanting to do more work in that area. And I got my access to more random samples, probabilities research, and was able to look at that. So that's what kind of got me thinking about that sort of issue.
So are you saying, just I want to make sure I understood correctly. So you're saying that people that are in mainline Protestantism were looking at evangelicals or quote unquote conservative Christians as
Yes.
being very, very bad, for lack of a better term?
Yeah, I think that's fair. I think that's fair to say. Now, my original sample was just
Is it the same vice
academic.
versa, or am I getting into a different topic?
No, it's not the same vice versa.
Interesting. Okay.
The other way around, conservative Protestants did not rank mainline Protestants lower than other groups. They rank them fairly highly. They obviously
Hmm.
rank their own in group higher than anyone else. I mean, yeah. But I think, if I remember correctly, I have to go back and look at the data. I think they ranked mainline Protestants the second highest among the other groups that they ranked.
Yeah.
And so it's not vice versa. And that's what really made it interesting. Why was this the case?
So is it? Would it be fair to say that there is more vitriol coming from the left to the right than opposite in your understanding? Or
Among Christians, I think that's true.
very interesting.
I'm not saying about the whole society. I think the whole
Right.
society that's a different animal altogether. You can more into politics and stuff like that. But among Christians, yeah, that's true.
Well, no, it's interesting because I personally actually I do find that it's really the discussions that I hear from people that I would say I know that are more progressive or left leaning, the way they speak about conservative Christians is very yeah, very I'm trying to think of the right word, not flattering. And it's not it's not the same the other
Derogatory?
way. Like
Yeah,
the other side might say we disagree, but there's not the same level of language
yeah.
that's used, I think.
Now,
Um,
just to be clear, we're talking about on the average, all right? So I
yeah,
don't. I have people say, "Well, I know this conservative Christian who just does nothing but bash progressive Christians," and of course, yes.
yeah.
And there are progressive Christians who don't have that. So we're talking about on the average, so that people don't hear this and go, "No, you're not. That's not true," because I know a guy.
Yeah. Yeah, I hear you. So I thought maybe an interesting way of walking through this. You have 8 chapters in the book. I came
Mhm.
up with questions for each of the chapters, and maybe we'll try to go in order, but we'll see how it goes. So maybe could we start with chapter 1? You talk a little bit
Sure.
about this modernist fundamentalist conflict within the church, and you're mentioning figures like Promise Keepers and Rosario Butterfeld, and nowadays I think the figures that maybe are capturing this divide are people like Christianity Today and Russell Moore, and then you have
Mhm.
somebody like a Doug Wilson in this evangelical world where it's always seem to be at odds when it comes to some of this political stuff.
Well, I would
I,
disagree with that, to be honest.
okay, fair enough.
I don't see Russell Moore as a progressive Christian at all. Not by the way not by the way it's defined. And
Okay,
I think you're looking at an argument with among conservative Christians rather than between conservative Christians and progressive Christians.
interesting. Okay, so who would you put in the who would you say captures the progressive mindset?
Someone like David Gushee would be a progressive
Okay, all
Christian.
right, fair
Someone
enough.
like someone like what's the name of that? Uh, he used to be at Mars Hill and now I can't remember his name.
Oh,
Richard Hill fell.
Holcomb, Justin
Well,
Holcomb,
what?
Justin Holcomb.
No, I don't remember his name,
Yeah, okay. Oh,
but
Rob Bell, the other Rob Bell.
Rob Bell, yes,
Yeah, okay.
Rob
The
Bell,
other
Rob
Marcel.
Bell.
Yeah,
Yeah. You know, Rachel felt help before
Rachel
she
Held
died.
Evans. Yeah. Hmm.
You know, those are progressive Christians. You know, if you look at someone like Russell Moore, theologically, he's conservative.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, that maybe is even is another subset of debates that are going on. But
Yeah, right.
probably in
Yeah,
general,
it's a
they would be
debate
more
within
on the.
conservative Christians. Yes.
He wouldn't agree with some of those other people on certain issues. Yeah, fair enough.
Yeah.
Well, anyway, so the question about the modernist fundamentalist conflict was: could you maybe capture and articulate the essence of that conflict, like
Sure.
that you were trying to draw out in the book?
So the modernist fundamentalist conflict, and when you talk about modernist fundamentalists, you're really talking about historical conflict that I think has today come to the conservative progressive conflict.
Okay.
So what we're looking at is the origins of today's conflict. And so, you know, the fundamentalists, you know, fundamentalist has a certain pejorative feel to it
Like
today. Uh,
1950s white
yeah,
picket
but
fences. Yeah.
when it came out, you know, it was
Yeah.
really a reaction to some of the concerns individuals had that the religion was drifting away from its fundamentals. And so there's a series of pamphlets and books called the fundamentals. And a lot of what people call the fundamentals today are really not things that are way out the way, you know, it's not what we really think of as high fundamentalists, but it really set a tone of, hey, we got war ourselves theologically and not get involved with all this other mess. Contrasting that was the modernists. Now the modernists were into what they call the social gospel, and the notion that, you know, what we have to do is, you know, to take care of the poor and the marginalized, because that's what Jesus would do. And you know, and that's the main task of Christians. And so this is the conflict that happened. The fundamentalists are saying no. For the most part, you know, nothing wrong with taking care of the poor stuff, but that's not what we're here to do. We're here to evangelize. We're here to give the right theological teachings. That's what we're here to do, and that's what our focus should be on. And we should not be in politics that much. The modernists were much more political, which I think is an interesting parallel to today, because despite what people say, uh, we look at, say, white evangelicals and their political activism, it's pretty average. It may even be a little bit lower than average, but it's at least pretty average. White evangelicals per capita are not highly political. And really, it's only until the moral majority came along that there was even much more of a
Mm.
movement among conservative Christians towards politics. Progressive Christians are more political per capita. The politics is more important to them, and so that's why we looked at this historical conflict, because I think it gives us insight into our modern type of conflict. Some
Mm.
of the parallels are really uncanny.
Yeah, it's interesting. So the conservative end, people would say the issues they care about are things like abortion,
Yeah,
LGBT
yeah,
stuff, other things related to that. And then on the progressive side, they're talking about larger societal, social justice type issues, which in general are more probably a little more on the political spectrum than the first two. The first two have become that because of
yeah.
the way the cultural conversation has gone. So maybe how would you describe, and you kind of get in this in chapter 2, how would you describe these differences in this conservative and progressive Christians? You know, what do they care deeply about? What's the motivating factor here? I think it's interesting about the conservative piece. You know, they would probably say that, you know, we're more focused on the future and, you know, our heavenly reward and things like that. So we're not as concerned about things that are happening on earth, where the progressive is
Mhm.
very much more concerned. And that's to some extent a theological issue that might drive political issues, similar to what's going on with the probably the Israeli conflict nowadays.
Yeah, yeah.
Um, in the
Yeah,
sense that theology is driving the politics.
right, yeah.
Yeah.
So here's the thing. If you know, if you take your average conservative Christian and you know what's important to them, what they'll tell you is what's important to them is the interpretation of the Bible. You know, you go back to the Bible. The Bible says that I do it. Now, here's a catch, and here's where we get into nuance. That interpretation could vary. And I'm not being a relativist. I'm not saying that, you know, that the Bible says anything, but I'm just saying that there are issues. And part of the conflict you were mentioning before between Moore and Wilson and all these, part of that is over, hey, here's how we interpret the Bible should say we should act in the public sphere, and
Right.
here's how
Right.
we say it should be. But what they both agree on is it's the Bible. It's God's word. And that's what the argument is over. It's not
Right.
allowable to
Okay.
say, well, the Bible says this, but I think this is right anyways. All right. So that's the argument you're having among conservative Christians. That's not the argument among progressive Christians.
Mm.
In fact, progressive Christians tend to say, the Bible is a great book, but you know, uh, some progressive Christians about how conservative Christians worship the Bible instead of worshiping Jesus. And some of them say they're Jesus followers. They're not necessarily the followers of the Bible. And so what I would argue is among progressive Christians, what they what they tend to do is they tend to have certain values, and I want to say political, but it's not just political. And if I say political, I think that narrows it too much. For them, these are moral values that
Right.
politics plays out in it. You mentioned LGBT. That's important to them too, only in a different way from
Yes.
conservative
Yes.
Christians. So that's important to them because for them, that's about inclusiveness and tolerance and love. And so, they interpret, how you interpret those values is their morality. Whereas the conservative Christians, they argue they create their morality by their interpretation of the Bible. And that is an incredible split. And that is why there's such a chasm between these two groups.
Well, maybe another case study would be the Roe v. Wade discussion. So obviously, since that's got overturned, you hear very different voices going in very different directions about the morality of that. So maybe could you apply what you're talking about here to that as a case study? Because you kind of get in that chapter 3 a little bit too.
It's very interesting, and in fact, if we were writing the book today, we may have had a little bit different twist on it. So, all right. So when we were writing the book, abortion was one of the few issues that progressive Christians go, well, maybe the conservative Christians have a point. Now,
interesting.
What we did find out is that the progressive Christians were not advocating for legal changes per se, but they were advocating, well, this is a taking of life, and it's not the right thing to do. So they're much more muted on that. But you still found voices that said, well, abortion is not a good thing. What I found out since Roe v. Wade has been overturned is that those voices have really silenced themselves. One of the biggest voices was Kristen Powers. She was actually, she was saying, look, we got to do something about abortion. And she's a progressive Christian. But after Roe v. Wade, she sort of shut up on that. So my thinking is that, and I'm only speculating because I don't have hard evidence on this, but I think it fits the evidence we do have, is that progressive Christians, their limits are the political limits of the larger left. When Roe v. Wade was in place, they were given some leeway to say abortion was wrong. I think that leeway has been taken away because I don't hear any of them, except for maybe I think Campolo still does. But I don't hear any of them really say abortion is wrong today. That leeway has been taken away.
Is there like an incentivization to do that, do you think? Like why would they all of a sudden go silent?
Because if they my theory is that if they were to say, look, I'm progressive, but I'm still strongly pro-life, that they would face sanction among the left and they'd be sort of ostracized among the left. And that is their peers. So one of the findings of my research was that the peers of progressive Christians were more political and the peers of conservative Christians were more theological. So that's their true peers. And when that's your peers, that's why you can reject the conservative Christians, because that's not what you're, the finding that drove me to this, why were conservative Christians who have a reputation of thinking that their way is the only way, why were they more accepted of progressive Christians and vice versa? Well, if your peers are political and not theological, then your agreement on, that Jesus was the Son of God or anything like that don't matter as much than your agreement on LGBTQ issues or on affirmative action or on how to fight poverty. But if what your morality is on your theological beliefs for conservative Christians, then the fact that mainline Christians come closer than, say, the Buddhists or the Muslims or the atheists makes them more acceptable than those other groups.
Yeah, I found that interesting. You mentioned that in there that the progressive Christians basically had more in common with Muslims. Is that an assertion that you made?
I won't, yeah, to some degree, yes. I mean, to some degree, certain types of Muslims. I mean, I'm sure that they would have problems with, let's say, the Wahhabis or something like that. But
Okay.
with certain types of Muslims, yeah, they definitely would see them as more their peers than a
Hmm.
conservative Christian. Yeah,
Gotcha, because there will be some more agreement. Well, I know that the folks that we have in town, that we have a mosque in town, and I know the guy who's the president of the society. He's much more on the progressive side.
yeah.
So that's a really interesting point. Could I give you another case study? So how would this like so abortion is that's kind of clear cut. What about like the discussions around the January 6th stuff? And it
Mhm.
seems like all the stuff with Trump and everybody's like, I'm unfriending you, I'm demonizing you. Is
Yeah.
does that fall into this discussion too here, or has that
Uh,
changed
yeah,
in the last 7 8
I
years?
think, I think this is an issue that divides conservative Christians, but not progressive Christians. I think most progressive Christians interpret January 6th
Mm,
the way that other progressives interpret January 6th. They call it, it's an insurrection and it's a revolt and it shows just how horrible Trump is and that all that sort. I mean, I think that it'd be hard to find a progressive Christian, a person who's a progressive Christian by our category, uh, that that doesn't feel that way. I'm sure they're out there, but they're not. Among conservative Christians, their argument, I mean, some conservative Christians, such as once again, Moore, David
yeah, more
French,
David French.
you
Yeah.
know, they're very much anti-Trump. Now, they're still conservative in their theological beliefs. So they're
Mm,
still, by as a sociologist, they're a conservative Christian. And then you got conservative Christians who are defending Trump. Uh, and so there's a much more of a split among conservative Christians on the whole January 6th thing.
yeah. Yeah. Very interesting. So, could I ask you about chapter 6? You start to deal with social identities.
Hmm.
Um, how would you say conservatives and then progressive Christians find their identity? And I'll just throw this out there. It seems to me that as the society becomes more secular, and there's this waning influence of religion within larger society, many people are turning to politics to then fill that
Hmm.
void, and so
Yeah.
politics, to some extent, almost becomes a religion. Which
Yeah.
the way you're articulating it to me makes it seem like that's very much prevalent on the progressive side, but not the conservative side. So how would you speak to that? And is
Yeah.
it do you find it particularly true with the demographic, like younger people?
Yeah. So uh, I do think politics can be a religion. I mean, I think there are people who say, no, no, religion is religion and politics is politics.
Hmm.
I think that
Well,
if you,
the current politics are making moral statements, right?
yeah, well, if religion's about systems of meaning and how you find meaning, clearly some people find meaning in their political activism.
Yeah.
To me, there's no doubt about that. All right. So now progressive Christians, and I want to be very careful because I don't want to say that their religion is politics, because I think their religion is a larger set of values.
Interesting. Okay.
And through those values, it drives their politics. Now there are people who will disagree with me. They'll say that politics is driving, and I understand that, but I don't want to go there because uh, I think our qualitative work shows that there are values beyond just the politics, beyond just the partisan politics of it, uh, which is driving progressive. And I think that that's how they have their identity. So they do have this identity of being someone who's tolerant and who's inclusive, and these are important values for them. And for them, they find these values among the Democrats, among the progressives. And we could, people could argue, well, it's not really there, and that's fine. But you could also argue, on the other hand, some of the interpretations of the Bible may not be what conservative Christians say as well. So I'm not taking sides on that. I'm just saying this is what's driving them, much more so than partisan politics. Uh, Now, once you get into the once you get uh, into the politics, then you tend to, and this is just natural, you tend to reinforce, you develop confirmation bias, tend to reinforce, okay,
Yeah.
yeah,
Yeah.
it's right to be here, and then you tend to make mistakes. You don't see the intolerance in your political party. All that happens. So I'm not saying that they're perfect.
Right.
I'm just saying that that's drives them. Whereas the identity for the conservative Christian is much more built on theological beliefs. And I think it's one of the reasons why that conservative Christians are actually less involved in politics than progressive Christians per capita. I mean, and the data on that, I mean, that's not even, that's not a controversial statement among anyone who's seen the data.
Yeah,
When I
no,
say
that
that, some people go, no, 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 no. Look at all they're doing. I'm saying, no, that's not even controversial. You're talking about per capita, it's not controversial. That's just simply true.
yeah, for sure. Do you think that some of those motivating factors, like as you're talking, I'm thinking about what is the hinge, and I'm wondering if the hinge is just ultimately what do they think about the Bible. And I
Hmm.
don't know if this is true, but I'll just put this out there. I'd sort of liken the way people the way a progressive looks at the Bible versus the way a conservative, more conservative theologically looks at the Bible is almost the way that there's a divide on how Supreme Court justices look at the Constitution. In that
Hmm.
a progressive would say the Constitution is a living, breathing document. It changes with time, and to meet the cultural needs. Whereas a conservative, by and large, would talk about this kind of strict constructionist reading of it. And it seems to me that's the way these two groups look at the Bible, uh, and
Yeah.
then that determines some of their moral activism. Would you find that to be true, or am I just totally off base with that?
No, I think there's something to that. You know, I think that there's a cartoon by this cartoonist called The Naked Pastor that I think summarize it. And I think the cartoon was
I'll have to
intended to
find
be a
that one.
hit for conservative Christians, but I think the conservative Christians would actually agree with that. And the cartoon goes something like this, I forget the exact picture, but the main line is, you use the Bible to define love. I use love to define the Bible.
Mm,
So the naked pastor is obviously a progressive Christian. And so for the Bible, how you look at the Bible, my idea of love and inclusion and tolerance, I use that to define how I look at the Bible. So the Christian looks at the Bible and goes, no, the Bible defines those things for me. And so it was intended, I think, to be a hit at conservative Christians, but conservative Christians look at that talk and they go, yeah, it's true. The Bible tells us what love is. We don't use our own interpretation of love with it. And then so I think that is a
yeah,
big dividing line.
yeah. What do you mean by love, ultimately, right?
Yeah,
Um,
right.
so can I ask you about the last two chapters in the book? You talk about this idea of in grouping and out grouping, and where how these two groups look at each other, and this might start to get us into some applicational questions for kind of the last third of our conversation here.
Yeah.
So I guess underneath those two things, and you can maybe tell us what you were doing in those two chapters, but is there any alignment that can happen between these two groups, these progressive Christians and conservative Christians? Is there any common ground, or are we just going to continue to see divides and there's no way to come together? And does that relate to this kind of in grouping, out grouping idea?
Yeah. I mean, I would not say there's never any type of possibility of common ground because I think that you can find some common ground. I think it's becoming less and less and less. And we end the book on a
Mm,
more, depending on your point of view, a pessimistic note that we think that the divide is permanent. And I'll say this on the divide. Since I
right.
work on racial issues, I've seen the racial divide in our country. And I think the intensity of the divide between progressive and conservative Christians is more than the intensity of the divide between whites and blacks in our country
I was going to
today.
ask you if the race is part of it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, I think the race, and that was one of the critiques, which I think was a fair critique of the book, that we didn't take race into account, which is funny since I'm a race scholar. But, but honestly, I think a lot of the argument is while we probably could have done more with race, and my co-author is a woman of color. So, you think we think about that. But I actually think the argument is much more within among whites than among non-whites. So it would be interesting to sort of break down, but I think that the intensity is much more among white conservative Christians than white progressive Christians than among people of color who are conservative Christians, people of color progressive
I
Christians.
have heard people make that argument that it is kind of the white liberal educated
Yeah,
versus the not that
yeah,
the conservatives aren't educated, but
you're
there
right.
is a
Yeah,
kind of
yeah.
intramural debate and discussion there.
And part of it might be that for example, African Americans who are considered Christians still tend to vote more for Democrats than Republicans, and so I think that takes the political uh, disagreement out of it, and that may be why, while there's theological disagreements between African Americans on the progressive and the conservative side, they don't have this level of hostility that I've seen. I've not noted that. So I do think that while we could have done something with race in this book, I'm okay with it because I think the argument is a lot among European Americans.
Mm. Yeah, that's really interesting. So you're saying that it's not as like African Americans or people of color basically are not they don't fight about this as much? Is that what you're saying? Because there's more
I think,
agreement?
yeah, right. I think that they don't. I mean, I think theologically they're not in more agreement, but I think that since conservative, uh, theologically conservative African Americans, I suspect this is true for other people of color, are more likely to vote for Democrats than they are for Republicans. And I know some of that may be changing, but they are today. They still are more likely to.
Well,
That takes a little bit of the bite out of it.
well,
You know,
even if
because
you had like there was a movement, I think I've seen the polling movement that if let's just say Latin Americans for Latinos for an example, like if you went from 10% to 30%, that's a big jump, but it's still majority.
but still, yeah,
Yeah,
still a minority.
yeah,
And and one of the critiques that progressive Christians have of conservative Christians is that you all are voting for racism and bigotry and da 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 da. What if woke up tomorrow and said, well, you know what, we're going to vote in higher numbers for Biden in 2020. Maybe we won't go 50%, but we'll go vote in higher numbers. Then I think the progressive Christians would be a lot less
yeah.
hostile towards him.
Interesting. All right, so maybe in terms of application, I don't know. Is there anything you would say to the church? Like, what are we just destined to be divided? And I guess if that is the case, what do we do? Is there a way
Yeah.
forward? Like, do you have any like advice for us?
Well,
Especially as we're getting into 2024, it's going to be
yeah.
probably another contentious election year, and
Well, if I can step out of my sociology
yeah,
role and just as a Christian, what I would say, I think I have something to say to both sides. I think I would say to the progressive Christians, you're not as tolerant as you think that you are. And it's easy to be tolerant for groups that we kind of like, but the test of tolerance is groups you don't like. And some of the stuff that I've heard progressive Christians say about conservative Christians is downright dehumanizing.
mm,
And I just say, hey, you have critiques of conservative Christians. I don't disagree with all your critiques, but the way you express them makes you question, just how inclusive you truly are, and maybe your foundation is not as strong as you think that it is. So that's what I would say to progressive Christians. To conservative Christians, I would say, this assumption about America as a Christian nation is an assumption that we have this sort of Christian community, and that does not exist. Just understand there's a lot of people who are Christian who deeply disagree with you, and they're not going to work with you on anything other than the most basic causes. And so
mm,
you are fooling yourself thinking that we're this sort of Christian nation that we can call everyone together.
yeah.
Just understand that is not reality, and you need to adjust to a post-Christian world, and stop telling yourself, "Oh, we're a majority of the population." You're really not.
Mm.
So that's what I would tell both groups.
So if you had to make any predictions on how the election cycle is going to go in the fall, could you make some? Like, what do you see?
Like who's going to win?
No, not who's going to win, but like how is the I don't know. What are the issues that are going to come up? How are people going to discuss them? And then like how should we navigate it? I guess what advice would you give us as we're having these political conversations, which are inevitably going to come this year?
Yeah. You know, that's an interesting question. I think that
I sort of wrap two together so you can take them apart.
yeah, I think as far as how we should discuss these things, one of my concerns is the deep polarization in our society, so deep that we can't solve our problems.
Mm-hmm.
That,
Yeah.
if one side says something, we have to be against it, even if it's a good thing. And I've seen this. I think seen this happen both ways. So, I mean, I just don't see how it's not going to happen, unfortunately. But if
Yeah.
somehow we could, I mean, I think unfortunately, if we had different candidates, maybe it could happen.
Yeah.
But if somehow we could turn the temperature down, and can we do that? Is there a way of doing that?
Is it possible to disagree without demonizing?
Yes. Yeah. To say just to I disagree with you. but you're still a human, and maybe and to find areas of agreement. Part of what I'm doing in race relations is talking about collaborative conversations, which apply in race, but I think apply political differences as well. Can we get to that point? Uh, I, you know, I just don't see that happening.
Yeah.
I wish I saw a path forward for that, but I don't see a path forward for that at this point in time.
Yeah. So,
Maybe after this year we could find our way to it, but I just don't see that happening. But if we head that direction, that'd be great.
well, of course, I guess Biden and Trump can't necessarily run after this year. So that'd be
Well,
different.
yeah, I mean, who knows? If Trump loses, maybe he'll run again.
Yeah.
There's nothing that stops him for his health.
Yeah.
But
Yeah.
but anyways, yeah, yeah, and of course, probably Trump drives it more than Biden does in certain ways. But I think if you look at the organizations beneath them, they are just both on both sides. They are just as dehumanizing to each other. So anyways,
Yeah.
that saddens me a lot.
Yeah. Or Trump may be more acute, but there definitely is stuff happening on the other side too.
There's no doubt about that.
So yeah, that's unfortunately, I do think that's probably how it's going to play out. Now, maybe we could, as a church, figure out a way to be kind of countercultural in that element. So I guess I don't know what would be. I don't know if we could play out a scenario. What would be a scenario where people in the church could actually have good conversations about real issues in a way that I don't look at the other person and say, "You're evil." Basically,
Yeah, I mean, I pray for the church to do that. I mean, I don't think the church is the origin of the problem. The church has been part of the problem, because, part of what I'm documenting is the sort of demonizing of each other. I mean, this gets at part of what I've been trying to do with cloud conversation, which is a conversation where it's goal-oriented, where we build on each other's ideas. And so, on race relations, I've been trying to do some research on that, see if we can figure out how to do it on race relations. But if we can figure out on race relations, maybe we can figure it out politically as well.
Yeah.
But yeah, I think that is part of what we got to do. We got to learn how to talk to people, because believe it or not, insulting people is not the best way to convince them that your point of view is correct. Drawing a swastika sign and saying GOP is not the best way of convincing people, nor calling people baby killers is the best way of convincing people. I mean, that just doesn't work. But there are actually techniques that we can use that actually can be persuasive and actually build community instead of polarization. And if we can head towards that as a society, we'd be so much better off.
Yeah, I think we've tended to lose the art of persuasion because it's hard, and we also don't like to step into these kind of tension conversations because it's so much easier just to talk with people that agree with me, right?
Yeah.
So maybe that's the first step in terms of having those conversations is having the courage to step in and talk about it and be okay if the person next to me doesn't think the same way that I do.
Yeah.
Yeah. Good. Well, George, thanks so much for being on here. Is there anything else you would want to mention as a parting shot? I think we got through all the questions that I wanted to ask you.
No, it sounds good to me.
Good. So pick up George's book. So the discussion today was focused on One Faith No Longer, and then Beyond Racial Division is the latest one, right?
Yes, that's the latest one.
Yeah. So go check that out. He's doing some really good work. Is there any other way that we could find you and follow you if we want to learn more about your work?
GeorgeYancey.com.
And that'll take you to wherever you need to go.
Yeah. Only George Yancey, Yancey, not CY. There's actually another George Yancey CY.
Yeah. Awesome. Well, thanks for being here today, and thanks so much for joining us for the Underground Sessions. We hope to see you on the next episode.